Hi, Paul Thompson here from Spitfire Audio. I've got 4 examples to show you today of different ways of using the piano with orchestra. Now, I've used some inspiration from film soundtracks. You'll probably be able to guess when I start playing them which ones they are. But let's just dive straight in. We'll look at the first one. I'll play it down and then I'll go into a bit more detail and show you the settings that I've used on BBCSO Piano to achieve that sound, but also how I'm getting the sound of the backdrop as well. So here we go, first example. Okay, no prizes for guessing what that's inspired by. So first up, let's look at the piano. So I've got the BBCSO Piano set up. Let's look at the microphones first. I've got the hammers and the ribbon mics. So just to remind you, the hammer mics are Sherp's mics, MK4s, directly over the hammers. And the ribbon mics are a tiny bit further back and capturing more of the sound as it's coming from the lid, but still pretty intimate. So that's a nice blend of sound because the Sherps have a very clear and pointed sound and the ribbons are slightly smoother at the top end. That's it. So it's just those 2 mics. So we're going for an intimate sound. And if we look up here, I've got the pedal volume and the hammer volume turned right up to the max. So I want the effect of all of those noises as I'm letting go the keys, as I'm touching the pedal, to be amplified, kind of magnified to the fullest extent. And everything that I'm doing is trying to take you into the piano as intimate as possible. There is one other change that I've made, actually, which is up here. I'm using exponential negative on the velocity mapping. And the effect of that is that it scales my MIDI output of the keyboard as it's going into the plugin, and it gives me much more of a focus on the lower end of the piano. Now that's useful for 2 reasons. Firstly, it's useful because it allows you to play softer, whatever your piano technique, it focuses everything on the softer end. But it's also useful because it gives you a greater amount of definition within that soft range. So in other words, you're able to access a kind of wider dynamic just within the soft range, if you know what I mean. Not explaining that very well, but hopefully you understand what I'm getting at. Now, what am I using in the background? The first sound that I bring in here, I'm just gently bringing in a solo violin playing, in fact, effectively 2, or you might be a double stop, but I'm playing just an open 5th and bringing that in and allowing the sound of that to grow. And that is the introduction to the string sound. So let me just show you that element quickly. And I love the bow change that you get. And this is just a way of kind of expanding out. The very first sound that you hear is this Olafur Arnalds Composer Toolkit pad, and then this pad from Albion 5, Tundra. And everything that I'm going for here is giving us a kind of feeling of intimacy, of stillness, of that feeling when everything has slowed down. And then the feeling that I go for halfway through is to bring in the Appassionata strings. Initially, they're just doing something very, very simple. I'm just using the straightforward legato patch. Mics-wise, I'm using a combination of mids and outriggers. So I'm going for quite a wide sound, but I'm using the mids to get you closer to the strings. So it feels like you kind of stepped forward and they're around you. That's the plan. And if we look at all of these strings together, you'll see that we're doing something very, very straightforward, slow, long, just a little bit of mod wheel and expression, just to kind of bring those sounds in and out of each other. You've always got to have movement there to get a nice musical feel. And then as we go further in, they follow the top line of the piano and then expand out. So there we go. That's the first example. Let's have a look at the second example. Now I've gone for something totally different here. This is a setting in which I've got the piano as part of the orchestra playing action music. Let's just play it down first, and then I'll show you the settings on the piano and we'll have a look at what else is going on. Okay, so you get the idea. It's a sort of fairly common use of the piano as a part of the percussion section. Now, how am I doing this? So let's start by opening up the piano. Starting at the end first, I've got back to linear velocity. I just want to straightforward. I want to access all of the dynamic range of the piano in the normal way. And then let's look at our mics. So I've got the outriggers up full and the sides up full and the spill. Let me show you what the effect of that sound is. Because the piano is in the concerto position, it's quite close to the tree. So what I'm doing here is I'm using the different microphones to push the sound of the piano back into the orchestra where you'd kind of expect to hear it. I'm using the spill mics to get that kind of sensation of space, and I'm using the outriggers to give me some width, and then the sides to give me that kind of feeling of being pushed out slightly. So if I just temporarily turn the onboard reverb off, you can hear we've got that nice kind of distance, but having just a little bit of that onboard IR, it just intensifies the Maida Vale room sound. That's the idea. And then I don't have any reverb on this one from Logic, so it's just literally what you're hearing now coming out the plugin. If we go back to the pedal and hammer, they're kind of back to the normal place, so we don't need to really get that sound. We're much more of a kind of distant feel right now. So how does that sit in with everything else? Well, I think it's kind of interesting to start by listening to the percussion section with the piano. So you get the idea. It's definitely a part of the percussion section. It's sat nicely into the sound of the percussion. And for this one, I'm using everything from BBCSO. So as you can see here, the timpani, BBCSO. Let's have a look at some of the tuned percussion. You can see I'm using the BBCSO tuned percussion. Let's put the strings up. So if we solo the short strings and the piano, again, that's quite a useful combi. So you can hear there, I've got all of this stuff. If I put up actually the region information here, I'm not quantizing anything. I really want it to kind of feel just performed. So if I was trying to get this absolutely pinpoint accurate, I would go in and quantize a lot of the notes and all that kind of stuff. But I like the feel that you get when you perform all of these parts in, and you get that slight looseness around the individual sections. The other interesting element is the short brass. Let's just hear that at the beginning. Okay, you get the idea. Everything I'm using here, by the way, with the rest of the orchestra, I'm just putting mix one up. So no real, no real extra effort needed to try and get this to all sit together. It sits together beautifully. The only reason we've dived into the mics of the piano is, as I'm saying, is to get the character correct, to get the position of the piano in the sound field correct for the purpose of sitting it at the back of the orchestra. So we want it to sound part of the orchestra, but we don't want it to kind of take over and feel like it's a piano solo backed by orchestra. So let's move on to our third example. And for this example, I am using, just so you can see, Spitfire symphonic strings. Okay, so let's start with the piano and see what settings we're using on that. So again, the velocity is just linear. Mic-wise, I've got the outriggers here at 75%, and then I've got the hammers and the mid-mics up at full. The idea of this is to get what I'm terming a kind of classic film sound. And I'm not saying classical, I'm saying like that classic kind of lovely, when the piano is really a featured element of the score, but it still sounds like it's part of the orchestra. It's not like that super close that we had at the very beginning. So we still want to feel the space that we're recording in, but the key thing is that we focus more on the closer sounds. We focus on the hammers and the mid to get us that kind of, standing reasonably close to the piano, and have a little bit less of the outriggers, just so we're balanced slightly closer in. The advantage of having the mid mics up is that it gives you more of the sound, the blended sound, as it comes out of the piano. So we're getting a feel of the intimacy with the hammers, but the mid is kind of blending through that and giving us a little bit of the high and low parts of the piano blended together. So it stops the directionality of the sound field, if you like. It gives you a little bit of help there. What are we mixing with the piano here? Well, it's very simple stuff. If I just pop contact up, you can see symphonic strings. Now I'm using close tree and outriggers. Why am I using them in this balance? And I've got the same balance on all the parts. I want more close because I want to feel and hear the individual players a little bit more. The tree is the thing that really kind of puts the sound in a block in the center. So I'm using a bit less of that, and I'm using a bit more of the outriggers, which give you a bit more width to the sound. You might imagine a bit more cinematic sound with that kind of slightly wider, slightly hyper-real thing. That's what I'm going for here. And actually, if I just play something. You get the idea. I'm only using the longs. I'm not even using any legato. It's just super simple. And if we look at the orchestration here, you can see that I'm occasionally doubling up. So I'm kind of sort of divising the sections, but I'm not worrying too much about that. But it's a very kind of chordal, there's a few nice little inner harmony movements. In fact, let's play it. Let's solo the strings there. So, you can hear where I'm going with this. The piano has got the simplicity, and the strings have got those occasional suspended notes and kind of added notes to just give it the warmth, the kind of crunch to it. That's the idea there. So very simple again, and that's how you get that sound. Now for my final example, I'm using what I'm calling the kind of piano love orchestral sound. It's slightly different. Let's have a listen, and then I'll show you what I'm doing. Okay, let's have a look at the piano first. So looking at the velocity, again, you can see linear velocity, so it's just a standard playing style. Now here I'm using the tree. And as you can see, nothing else selected. So the piano is sat in the concerto position, but when you have the sound of the decca-tree, there is something that really locks you into the feeling of the classical world. It's quite a powerful way of hearing things because we associate it. There's a lot of kind of baggage that we've got with recordings made with the decca-tree. And if I just give you a quick blast of the piano on its own. It's just a very, very classic sound. And that's the advantage of having the tree on its own. So straightforward piano. What am I using in addition? For the flute, I'm using the Total Performance flute from the Spitfire Symphonic Woodwinds, which gives you that fabulous everything. You just play, it sounds great. And I'm using that for the flute solo that follows the line of the piano with a few divergences. The chamber strings is the string section for this. And again, if we just look at the contact here, I'm simply using the longs. I've got a similar mic balance to the one that I used with the symphonic strings, but it's slightly more evenly balanced between close and tree. The chamber strings doesn't ring the room as much because it's fewer players. So the more ambient mics don't give you a kind of reverby sound. They just add a kind of dimension to the sound. Now, what I've decided to do creatively for this is I've put a ton of reverb on it, and I'll show you what I'm using. Cinematic Rooms Professional. I've jacked up the reverb time to 3 and a bit seconds, and I'm using a little bit. It's slightly different. Equal mix for reflections, all that kind of stuff. So there's no huge differences to the way it just loads up. It's a really nice sound. But the effect, if I solo the strings here, then you can hear the effect on the overall string sound. So the advantage of doing this is that you end up with a really beautifully intimate sound, and then putting the reverb on top of that, giving it a really huge bloomy reverb, but just sitting it below the sound, gives you an interesting kind of hyper-real sound that's very, very different from recording the strings in a very, very reverberant, like a cathedral or something. It's a kind of beautiful, kind of glossy bloom is the best word I think I can use to describe it. And that helps the overall thing sit really beautifully together. If you look at the flute treatment as well, and look at the way that I'm treating the flute, again, I've got cinematic rooms on that. It's not quite as large because I don't need it to be quite as big on the flute sound, but it is helping to give that overall sound. I've got a tiny bit on the piano, again with a big reverb, and I'm using less of the reflection sounds for the piano sound. I want to kind of tilt it more towards the signature of Maida Vale rather than imposing another signature early reflection sound on. Now, all of these things, people agonize over reverbs, early reflections. If you've got a really nicely recorded instrument in a beautiful acoustic in a nice room, it is a lot more forgiving, and you can be a lot more creative with your reverb choices. It really isn't that hard to blend these sounds together because you've got a good signature to the original sound. If you're dealing with a sound that's just been recorded in a vocal booth or is very dry, then it's slightly harder because positioning the sound in a space and all that kind of stuff. It's just a little bit of a more involved process. But with these sounds, it's usually quite easy. So let's have one last listen, and I will highlight all of the parts so that you can see them, how they interact here. So that's it, my 4 examples of using the piano in the context of orchestra for scoring. Hope that there was some useful stuff in there, that maybe you've taken a few ideas away from that to use in your own productions. Thank you very much for watching as ever. Look forward to seeing you on the next one. Bye-bye.